Hello and welcome to another episode of the Whoever Podcast, a Christian podcast for non-Christians. My name is Brian.
I'm Andrew, and today we are reading from Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. The numbers are really little in this Bible. I want that to be clear. All right. And I might need glasses. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Brian, do you want to give us the context for where we're at?
Yeah, sure. So, thus far, Jesus has come to earth. He has been healing physically and spiritually, I think is a good way to put it. He's caring for people physically. He's healing them, helping in that sense. But he's also spiritually, he's forgiving sins. He's giving them hope and joy. And we just went through a pretty big section of teaching where Jesus is teaching a lot of people and sharing parables. And some of the parables are a bit confusing, but he is still willing to explain that to the disciples. And now at the end of this day of teaching, it says in verse 35, it says, when evening came, let's go over to the other side. So they leave the crowd and they go into this, they go across this lake. Is this the Sea of Galilee? Is that the lake they're talking about?
I definitely think that it is.
Think it is.
That's the impression I get. And a couple of years ago, I was very lucky to be able to go and see this area. The Sea of Galilee you can see to the other side of it. You can see the edges of it. It's kind of a large oval, but so they call it sea, but lake is probably a better word. It's a large lake. Sure.
Yep. Yeah, a very large lake. And it's interesting, we see that there's a furious squall that comes up, and from what I've read about the Sea of Galilee, is this was actually something it was notorious for, is having these storms just crop up out of nowhere, and they were pretty intense. And I think it's interesting that, if you remember, way back in the beginning of Mark, the people that Jesus called, some of his disciples were fishermen. So they're very used to this water. They know this lake. They're used to these kinds of storms. They're very familiar with boats. And so when we see that they're freaking out, they ask the question, "Don't you care if we drown?" Like, this must be a serious storm. If they think they're not going to make it, these experienced guys, this must be a pretty big deal.
Yeah, these aren't particularly large boats, so if waves are breaking over the boat, it would not take much to fill the boat with water, and then you would sink, and they would all drown if they were in the middle of this lake in this storm. So their worry is very reasonable, but Jesus' response to them is, "Why are you worried? Don't you have any faith?" Which is, it's hard for me to understand even reading this, like, why Jesus would necessarily say that to them, except that they had seen his care for them and his ability to do these miraculous things. And so now he gets up and he directly rebukes wind and waves, and even they obey him and the water's calm.
Yeah, I read one commentary on this years ago, and it stuck with me that, Jesus says, "Quiet, be still," and he commands the storm. And it's interesting because this is the same voice, the same God who created the waters and the waves, way back in creation. So there's almost this interesting idea that the waves recognize, oh yeah, this is the guy who made us. This is the guy who has authority over us. And so when Jesus says, "Quiet and be still," and it says it was completely calm, this is a huge miracle that these disciples witness. In fact, this is the first miracle of this kind, I think, right? Jesus hasn't done something with the natural world like this yet in Mark, has he?
No. I mean, timeline-wise, we're aware that he's turned water into wine. He did that at the very beginning of his ministry. Mark doesn't talk about it. This is probably worth saying. There are 4 different Gospels, right? These are 4 different people wrote down, hey, the story of Jesus, and they include different things. Each of them don't put everything in.
It's kind of like if 4 of us were to all go on a road trip, and then after the road trip we were to write down what we experienced. We all saw the same stuff, we all experienced the same thing, but we would all write from a slightly different perspective, and there are certain things that would stick out more to me than to Andrew, and vice versa. And so that's what we have here with the 4 different Gospels, is we have 4 people who have accounts of the same thing going on. They're not disagreeing, they just emphasize different things.
Yeah, in fact, if you read the end of John's Gospel, he directly says, I didn't write down everything that Jesus did. He says, I don't have enough paper to do it.
Right.
So the gospel writers are picking and choosing what are we going to put in to try to convey who Jesus was and what we saw and what happened.
Yeah. But back to what I was getting at with the nature here, though, I think this is probably the most powerful, or maybe on the big, like the biggest scale miracle so far that they've seen. They've seen Jesus heal people. They've seen Jesus turn water into wine. That's not in Mark, but it's in other Gospels. Yep. We've seen him cast out demons, but here Jesus is calming an entire storm. And this is a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm. So this is the disciples. They still, I don't think, we don't know for sure, have it figured out. I don't think that they have completely who Jesus is and what he's there to do yet, but they get another clue, another glimpse of this, because they say, who is this that even he has even this power that we hadn't seen before? Yeah. They're even more baffled by, we're following Jesus. We a minute ago they said, we don't want to turn away from you. You have life and truth in you. We want to follow you. And now they're saying, we're following him, but who is this guy?
What is going on? I mean, this is it's interesting you said that they're following him, but they're still not quite sure what he is. I don't think that we're quite sure who he is yet. Yep. I think we're in the same boat. That was an unintentional pun about being in the same boat.
Well, you floated it right out there.
Do you see what I did there?
I do see what you did there.
Wave if you like it.
Yeah, thank you.
But I think we're in the same metaphorical boat.
They're going to get wind of this.
Be quiet. Be still. We're in the same metaphorical boat in that we're still learning about who Jesus is. It's amazing that people have dedicated their entire lives. Thousands of theologians, pastors, over thousands of years have dedicated their entire lives to following Jesus and figuring out who he is, and we still are learning more about God, and that grand mystery, I think, is all the more proof of God's existence, so we can't figure him out. But I think for today, what this encourages us today is that there are a lot of times storms and just these furious squalls, these things that crop up out of nowhere. We get blindsided by things in life, and we're just like, oh my goodness. Sometimes it's a really bad medical diagnosis, or we lose a loved one, or we get fired from our job, whatever it is, and we get this massive storm just comes up out of nowhere. And this is a metaphorical reminder that God's like, hey, I got this under control. I know what's going on here. And I think it's a reminder that nothing happens outside of God's control. This storm was wild and crazy, but Jesus is like, nope, I still have authority over this.
Yeah, it's part of the Christian life, part of what we refer to when we talk about growing in our faith is understanding that in ways we can't predict or know ahead of time, God has it. He has things covered. And so I'm not good at it yet. I find myself worrying and trying to bother with things that I shouldn't be, but there are things that God holds in his hands, in this case a storm, and in our lives the sickness of a child, or jobs or other things that God does have, and it is the right response for us to calmly trust that. But that's hard, and we work on it every day.
Yeah, and I think that there is a response. The disciples here, they didn't just sit back in the boat and do nothing. They weren't just like, okay, well, God's got this. I'm just going to sit back and relax. They came to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is, we're not saying that when life goes wrong, just sit back, kick back, and see what God does. I think that there is an element where we need to go to God and be honest about that and say, Lord, I'm scared right now. You know, that's what the disciples, you know, Lord, I'm scared. I don't know what's going on. And if you're watching this or listening to this and you've never prayed before, or you're still not even sure God is real, you can still say, hey, God, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you're listening to this. Just be honest in that prayer and say, you know, if you are real, though, like, help me out here, you know, encourage me a bit. Because as we've seen through Mark, God meets us where we're at with faith, and then he brings us along.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys, that's about the time we've got for this episode, but we hope you'll join us for the next one.
Yep. Take care.
Bye.